Welcome to the Breakfast Club. My name is Zenzele Ndebele and this is Asake Online. Today in our program we'll be talking about exhumations. We have heard a lot about the issue of exhumations and reburials when it comes to Gukurahundi, and we want to find out why are exhumations very important and why do families want to exhume their relatives that died during Gukurahundi. But before we get to this very serious and sensitive topic, I just wanted to talk about the new developments in the city of Bulawayo. Last week, the Center for Innovation and Technology site launched a new application called Fix My City. Basically, this is a mobile application that allows you to report faults in your area. This could be water pipes that have been burst or that are bursting or that are leaking. This could be a sewage pipe. This could be a manhole, lights that are not working, ZESA, anything that involves service delivery, and you think that there's something wrong in your area that needs the authorities to attend to. All what you need to do is that you take your mobile phone, you take a picture, you describe the issue. Let's say you say Empopoma block 5 gule pipe edubugileyo, then you send to the number below. This is basically a WhatsApp number which will then receive this information, upload it on a website and forward the issue to the city council authorities so that they can attend to it. And many people will ask, but why do that? Why not call directly and all those kind of things? We've realized that many times these days people use a lot of mobile phones. This is WhatsApp. And lama phone calls la dura. So if we can allow people that whilst they are busy chatting on WhatsApp, they can also be able to report faults, it will be very easy. And also it helps to have a database of all the issues that we have in Bulawayo. So we can know that we have 10 water pipe bursts, we have 15 lights that are not working. I'm sure it helps the city council to plan, to deploy resources to the right place, and also anticipate that a month we are likely to have so many faults and budget accordingly. So we believe that this is one area or one way to try and help build our city, create the pride that we've always had, and rejuvenate our city. It's not nice to know but we are saying as the citizens or as the residents of Bulawayo, we can actually restore the pride by actually helping the city maintain these places or areas of residence by repairing whatever we've broken down. But like I said, back to our program, today we are talking to Shari Appel, who is the director of Ukuthula Trust. And she has been working on the issues of exhumations for the last 20 years. She has experience not only in Zimbabwe, but regionally and internationally. And we want to find out from her why it is important for the issue of exhumations to be done in a proper way. And what is the proper way? Why are families so much interested in actually reburying their relatives, especially those who were buried in shallow graves? I hope this program will open our eyes and our ears and our minds and give us an idea of how we should handle the issue of exhumations, because I've heard a lot of wide views from people. Others are saying we should not exhume, the graves are crime scenes and they should be preserved like that until a time when there will be a process or an internationally recognized process to actually exhume and get evidence. The question is, what evidence can we find in the graves? And how long can these graves stay undisturbed? We're talking about 36, 37 years after the genocide. What's there? Is there anything left in the graves anyway? So Shari Appel will try and break this down for us so that we have an understanding of what we talk about when we talk about exhumation. Briefly tell us about the work that Ukuthula Trust does.
Ukuthula Trust is a Zimbabwean-based NGO. All of us who work in it are Zimbabweans, including myself. And over the last 25 years, as a collection of people, we've had human rights experience, and we've been working on the issue of Gukurahundi, some of us since 1995. Ukuthula Trust is looking at peace building and healing, repairing the social fabric, recovery of historical memory, and we undertake a variety of programs which deal with these issues. But I know the one that you're interested in today is our experience with exhumations and reburials. And that's something which We began as a different organization, but with many of the same staff, more than 20 years ago now, back to 1998.
We have been talking about exhumations a lot in the last 2-3 years in Zimbabwe, and one would ask, I mean, why now? And probably it's the change of government, but why are exhumations very important in the Zimbabwean context? Right.
Well, they have always been very important, but not very possible to do. You know, I was one of those who researched and wrote the Breaking the Silence report, for example, which was the first major history of the Gokorohindi atrocities, and remains one of the more thorough histories of that era. And even in that report, which came out in 1997, there was a chapter called Recovery of Human Remains. Okay, so for a very long time this has been acknowledged that this needs to happen. And I found this was reinforced when I went out. I was originally, or I am still, a psychologist by original training. And when I went out in 1998 into communities affected by Gokorohindi and started to ask people, what is the impact of those years on you? One of the overwhelming issues which people brought right from the beginning was that of what I will loosely call the angry dead, which is the fact that families didn't know what to do in order to honor their dead, because they were buried in the wrong place. They were buried in animal holes, in schoolyards, next to cattle dips, in business centers, which meant that the families weren't able to carry out rituals or do umbuyiso, and they talked about being haunted by the angry spirits of their dead, who would come to them in dreams, crying, begging to be dug up and brought home. And when we spoke to traditional leadership, they also were very concerned about this phenomenon, and they talked to me, explained to me the problem of bones in the forest. And they said that every year in late winter, it's the responsibility of the traditional leadership to cleanse the forest of the bones of animals that might have died over the last year, for example. But that the one type of human remains which they really battle, the one type of bones which they battled to move were those of human beings, who were often just on cave ledges without being properly buried, or, you know, in holes in the ground without being properly buried. And they considered these to be bones in the forest, but bones around which they as traditional leaders didn't know what to do. Quite often they didn't know who are these individuals, for example. And they also feared the spirits of the angry dead, you know, at some level, and didn't really know what to do. So we brought in a team of experts from outside the country to start training us as Zimbabweans through the practical example of working on graves, which we had dug up. And that process continued, you know, for several years and through until 2001. And then there was a long period in which we didn't exhume. And during that time, I actually went overseas and got a master's in forensic anthropology, came back and started to train some colleagues here. So we are now a team of 7 who are fully trained and fully capable of exhuming to international standards.
Tell us about the process of exhumations. What happens? We are talking about people who are just mass graves, for example, and or someone who's been there. How would you know that this is the person that we want to exhume?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is an absolutely essential issue. That, you know, you don't just say there's a grave and you pick up a spade and you go out and dig, and now you've got some bones, and then you just make a guess on who this person is. What we know from experience is that many of the graves from the Gokorohindi era, people know exactly who's buried where, because they were forced to bury those dead, or people were left dead and they had to be buried in a hurry because it was a curfew and people were afraid of the soldiers. So they just buried people where they fell, which wasn't in the right place. And so there's a long process of information gathering which needs to go on prior to any exhumation, so that we are fairly certain who is in a particular grave, whether it's a single or a mass grave, prior to going and digging. Because for me, as this is a process of healing, what is really essential is that at the end of the day, a specific family gets back a specific set of human remains. And if you just randomly go and start digging up bones and you don't know who they are at the end of the day, then what do you do with them? You dig them up, and now what? You have to bury them as anonymous individuals again, and we need to try and avoid that, and as much as possible give them to the right people. So part of that process as well, you know, a family member might come to us and say, my father is buried under this tree, and our first question will then be, how do you know? Did you bury him yourself? And if that family member says no, then we say, who buried him? So it's this process of trying to track back to eyewitnesses, and in particular those who actually took part in burials, because these are the people who may be more convincing to me as an expert than a family member who says, my uncle was told by the chief 30 years ago, you know, that this is my father's grave. Okay, for me, that's quite a distant sequence of events, and I want to see if I can't get back to those who actually buried. Then the other thing which we need from family members is what we call pre-mortem data. What this means is we want to know biological information about the dead person, such as, for example, obvious things. Were they male or female? How old were they at the time of death? How tall were they? And again, what you may find is that a son may come to us saying, I want an exhumation. But the person who will remember how old and how tall the deceased is may be a widow, maybe a sibling, maybe a parent, if there's still a parent, you know, of that individual. And so again, it's this question of going out and finding the people who can give us the biological information. Information about teeth is very important, for example, because it's the only part of our skeleton which is visible when we're alive. And, you know, when we smile or talk, other community members are clear. There's a gap in the teeth. There's a missing tooth. You know, sometimes relatives will tell us, well, he had all his molars pulled out, or he had a gold tooth. And all of this is important information in terms of deciding if the human remains are indeed who we've been told they are when we exhume. So there's a lot of history taking and research which has to be done. And the important thing about this is that it has to be done in a very empathetic and careful way. It has to be done as a form of counseling, if you like. You don't just arrive with a form and start asking questions. Okay, it needs to be a real conversation, because very often this is emotionally difficult for families to try and conjure up an image of the person who died, who they may not have thought about for many years. And in fact, what we find is that often these families haven't talked about the deceased, and certainly not as a whole family together, since the murder. And so it's a complicated process which needs to be dealt with the utmost respect and care. It's also a process which might require, for example, the presence of the executive power in the family, who may be somebody who, for example, lives in Johannesburg and only comes home once or twice a year. It's important to make sure that this person is consulted, that this person has also given his permission for an exhumation, so that if you decide to dig, this isn't going to be a source of new conflict in the family, because this is supposed to be about returning something to the family in a way that everyone has agreed needs to happen.
You have mentioned the importance of the family. And for me, I think everything is at the center of the family. So why is it so complicated if it's just about the family?
Well, you know, this for me is a very good question. You know, if a family is desperate to have back their human remains, you know, one of my questions is, who else does it actually concern, to be quite honest? I mean, if you know, your father died next week, let's hypothesize, and you wanted to bury him, whose business would it be except the immediate family to say, this is our father, this is how we want to bury him, this is what needs to happen, we want a priest, or we want a traditional leader, or we want both, this is the kind of ceremony that we want. Why is it anybody else's business, you know, at some level? And, you know, although I understand that, you know, these are obviously very, you know, political murders, there are concerns linked to that. At the end of the day, I still firmly believe that the decision to exhume or rebury has to primarily remain with the family and with the traditional leadership. I also understand the feeling of the state that they need to be somehow involved in this process, and of course the state is always involved at some level when somebody dies, okay, because normally you have to go and get a burial order. If you want a death certificate, that is a process which involves the state. But these are not normally processes which preempt the primacy of the family and those which the family chooses to involve in terms of making the decision, should this person be properly buried or not.
I've had a lot of people saying, you know, cook around the graves, these are, you know, crime scenes, they should not be tampered with. What would be your response to that?
Well, my response to that is at some level that's true. I mean, at another level, there are general amnesties in effect, and therefore these are not crime scenes. There's nobody who can be prosecuted in terms of this. But I also feel that, you know, that if you have a relative who's buried somewhere and you don't want to dig them up because you think that their grave is a crime scene, then don't ask for an exhumation. But if you're a family who the most important thing to you is that you want your dead back to be buried in the right place and respectfully, then that is a family decision which I think everybody needs to respect. And that others shouldn't be saying, you can't dig up these bones because these are evidence of a crime. You know, this decision resides with families.
I mean, is it true that, I mean, by exhuming the dead, people are destroying evidence?
Well, if the dead are exhumed by forensic anthropologists and forensic archaeologists such as ourselves, you know, what is important is that the exhumation is carried out professionally in keeping with minimum standards, and there are many, many such minimum standards. The International Committee of the Red Cross, for example, which is an impartial body involved in recovery of the dead in all sorts of contexts, whether that's migrants lost at sea or people who die in wars or, you know, whatever it is. The International Committee of the Red Cross has minimum standards which they use in order to recover those bodies. And that minimum standard part of that is to conserve what we call perimortem trauma, which is trauma to the body at the time of death. But it's also about conserving the biological information. So an expert exhumation will conserve both of those things. The evidence, the physical evidence of what happened to somebody at the time of death, but also the physical evidence of who that person is, which is what is retained in the body in terms of age at time of death, stature, either what we call pre-mortem evidence. For example, if you break your arm when you're 19, your arm will still have a slight bony callus, which indicates that you broke your arm at some point in your life. And this can also be a means of identification. So you want to exhume without causing post-mortem damage. Now, for example, if you're not an expert, and you go in there with great big shovels or front-end loaders or, you know, whatever it is, you're going to cause massive post-mortem trauma to those human remains, which will destroy not only evidence of what happened at time of death, but also evidence of who that person is. And again, in the event of it being a mass grave, you end up with commingled human remains, which means that it's no longer clear which arm and which leg belongs to which individual. For me, this is desecration of human remains. Which, I mean, if somebody was recently dead, you wouldn't go in and chop off their arm and leg before burying them, or chop an arm and leg off one person and chop an arm and leg off another person and then muddle them up and not care. You would never treat a complete body in that way. Why treat bones in that way? Which means that you need somebody who knows how to go into a mass grave and exhume in such a way that everyone gets their right fingers and toes back, and that everybody gets every single bone back. Okay, there are 207 bones in a human body. Every bone has a name. Every bone has a side. And every human being should have all of their 207 bones, when they get buried, laid out in anatomical order, and you need an expert to do that. To come back to the matter of evidence, it is very important that families get complete stories, and we always record evidence in order that families can be told there's evidence of blunt force trauma, there's evidence of gunshot wounds or whatever at time of death. But I think that often people overestimate how much evidence bones carry. And for example, you know, cause of death is almost always soft tissue damage. Okay, people die because they exsanguinate, they bleed out. They die as a result of massive beatings. They die from a heart attack or a stroke caused by excessive beating, for example. These are the things which are cause of death. And if I exhume a set of remains, I might be able to say minimum number of blunt force blows, 5. But 5 broken bones or 10 broken bones is not a cause of death. So I think that people, you know, over anticipate what it is that skeletons can reveal. Okay, skeletons are the skeleton of what happened in the end. Okay, and much of that evidence will have been lost, and it's our responsibility to be conservative. But on the other hand, of course, finding somebody in a clandestine grave or in a mass grave, that already says something about how this person died. And, you know, but it's not for me to say, to reach that conclusion. For me, that comes now back to perhaps a National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, perhaps to an Attorney General or Registrar General. Somebody else needs to come up with an appropriate wording for what should be on a death certificate in relation to that. Because, you know, one of these issues is that people want death certificates which reveal the truth about what happened.
Some of these graves have been there for many years, 36 years. How difficult it is to actually identify the grave, seeing that most of these people are now old and some of them are already dead? Yeah, I mean, this is a major problem as well, and it's one of the other things which makes exhumations increasingly urgent. It depends. We've retrieved bones in a wide range of conditions in the last couple of years. And if you're digging in dry, arid soil, for example, the bones are likely to be in good condition, actually. But if you're digging in soggy soils or acidic soils, or where bones have been buried in a shady area where perhaps bones sit in puddles during the rainy season, you know, for months at a time without drainage, those bones are showing a lot of damage, a lot of leakage. And in fact, entire torsos, such as ribs and vertebrae, which are made up of spongy bone or very thin bones, they can be almost entirely eaten by the soil already. So, you know, this is my concern, that very soon, in some areas, in other areas, bones will remain in a good condition, as we know, sometimes even for centuries, you know. But in other areas, within a couple of decades, those bones have turned to dust or they've turned to soil. So it is urgent if we want to be able to even give identity to human remains, because we lose the biological profile as well as what people might call the evidence, you know, which is the evidence of trauma at time of death. It's not just the evidence which will go missing if we delay a lot longer. It's proof of identity. So what happens after the exhumation? We've done the exhumation, but then what? What's the process that we follow? What happens is we don't exhume one day and then on the same day give those remains to people. Because to me what is absolutely key is that we're sure for ourselves, as people who can understand the language of bones, that when we give those human remains back to that family, it really is the remains of, you know, which should go to that family. And for that, we need to do what's called a profile analysis of the remains. For that, we take about 70 or 80 measurements of every skeleton, which can include the diameters and circumferences of long bones, the length of long bones. There are many, many measurements which we take on the cranium, on the skull of the person. And then all of these measurements get fed into formula and into computer programs, which will tell us the probability of who that person is at the end of the day, and also of how tall they were. Then we have to do what's called non-metric evaluations. So we aren't relying on measurements, we're relying on our eyes, our expertise, and standardized samples with which we compare the pubic symphysis, the auricular surface, the sternal rib ends, the condition of the vertebra, any other signs of things like arthritis and bone decay, for example. And we take all of that into account to come up with an estimated age at time of death. And, you know, again, one of the things which is important around this is preservation of bones, that we need these surfaces to be well preserved if we're going to be able to do that. Once we've done all of this, we also do an analysis of any visible trauma.
to come up with our peri-mortem data in terms of what happened at time of death. And all of this we write up in a report, which we give to the families. And in the event, you know, we could also give this information to National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, any other kind of Truth Commission process, to start to build a history. And for me, you know, I think that when we're talking about witnesses who have a right to talk, and we've heard many, many, many things said in the last couple of years about how there should be a dialogue around Gokoro Hindi and about the right of those affected by Gokoro Hindi to speak. For me, the bones have a right to speak. Okay, the bones are eyewitnesses to events. They're very, very important eyewitnesses, and they have a right to be safe, and they have a right not to be trashed by people who don't know what they're doing, and they have a right to have a voice. And their voice is an important part of this history, and we need to honor that and to recover them in a respectful, impartial, expert way in order to listen to what it is they can tell us.
Recently, the President of Zimbabwe talked about you know, fast-tracking the issue of exhumations. What's your comment on that?
Well, I'm hoping that this is just a phrase that gets used by this government, and that maybe what they mean is fast-tracking, coming up with a methodology for how exhumations can be prioritized, rather than that they're going to go out and suddenly dig up bones with great speed. Because as you will have heard from what I've said, you can't rush the digging up of bones. You know, it requires stages. And we as an organization already have, you know, done a lot of work around this in terms of speaking to families, and we already have a lot of pre and peri-mortem information. But this is something which takes time. And exhumations themselves, you know, cannot be rushed. You know, you have to go in very carefully, which means that you aren't using, you know, giant digging instruments. You might to take down the first foot or two of a grave. And again, this depends on whether you have very good eyewitness information on how deep are the bones. If somebody says we buried the bones hip deep, then maybe you can speedily remove the sand to knee deep. And then after that, you start to go very much more cautiously, and you start to use very small digging instruments so that you aren't going to crack a skull with a spade and damage it. And you dig with tiny little tools in the end, with toothbrushes, with paintbrushes, with dental tools, so that you are uncovering the human remains in a way that they can tell this, you know, the precise story of how they have lain all of these years. So, you know, there's no fast tracking of that. It has to be done at the pace which it has to be done. Otherwise, you're going to be trashing human remains, commingling them. You're going to have post-mortem trauma, which is going to mask the identity of that individual and the story of what happened to them.
We have touched the other side of that, the bones, they might be actually, you know, we might be losing some of the bones. But also let's look at the eyewitnesses. We are talking about 38 years. The eyewitnesses, obviously, those who were not being killed were older, 40, 50 then. So how many people still remember exactly where the grave is? Exactly.
I mean, and this is one of the tragedies, is that we are losing eyewitnesses. We've already lost many, many eyewitnesses, which actually already means there are many, many individuals who we will never be able to recover and name in a simple way. There are many graves which we may never even know this is a grave, okay, because people are buried in things like anthills and antbear holes, things which, and a lot of graves were not marked. So those graves are already vanishing into landscapes. And there may be only one or two people left alive that can say this is actually a grave and this is the person buried there. I mean, one of our eyewitnesses that we interviewed last year, who played a key role in burying two people who he saw murdered, and he helped to bury them. And he is 96 years old. Is he going to live, you know, to see this exhumation, you know, which he very much wants to do? It would be part of his healing. You know, just for him to talk about what happened and the role that he played in burying these people was extremely emotional for him. And for me, he has a right to witness the correction of this wrong, if you like. And I'm concerned. Well, he's already given us his information, but he also deserves to be alive. And it also makes me wonder how many other 90-year-olds are out there who will carry to the grave with them key information which families, children and grandchildren of the deceased may want in the future in terms of who lies where. Of course, the other thing, I've talked about biological eyewitnesses. And the person who knows somebody best is often the mother. We've almost lost all our mothers at this stage, and our mothers are very old. I did have a mother in our offices just a few weeks ago who was very old, and she's blind. She can barely walk. And she came into our offices to say to me, I want to rebury my child before I die. And I wonder, will she live to rebury her child before she dies? You know, these are urgent requests. And so people who say, well, the bones have waited 38 years, does it wait if they matter another few years? It does matter. It matters to these very old mothers, these very old eyewitnesses who we rely on for biological information, who we rely on for eyewitness accounts of what happened on those days.
I mean, as we move to the conclusion of this program, what is your ideal situation of these reburials? What would be the ideal thing to do?
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission is the right Chapter 12 instrument to oversee these exhumations at some level. Okay, we've agreed there's some need for state engagement around these, which to me is secondary to the need for families and traditional leadership to be engaged. But of course, the state needs to be engaged in these processes. And as I've said, this is a truth recovery process in many ways. And so the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, their mandate is to control truth. Their mandate is also to oversee healing in relation to violence of the past. So for me, this would be an ideal situation where traditional leadership, families, the NPRC, and others who want to offer services, including our team, taking into consideration that we have 20 years of forensic anthropology experience, and we have longitudinal case records of how exhumations can heal communities, not just the families, but the communities. This is what should happen, you know, in the future. But for me, it's also an urgent matter.
I mean, one of the things that I've had the debates on social media and everywhere, people talking about, that they were saying, let's have the truth first before the exhumations. What starts? Is there an order that you need to start with the truth telling, then end with exhumations? And is there any particular order in this case?
Well, for me, you know, in my experience, exhumations are truth-telling. Exhumations are a day on which the bones have an opportunity to speak, to be witnessed, to be heard, if they are very carefully revealed. And it's a day on which families get to reclaim family truth, and communities get to reclaim community truth, and also in which eyewitnesses are vindicated, and that the stories which they have been telling are shown to have been true. So I always feel that every exhumation is like a mini truth commission, actually. And what is important is to have, you know, many people observing this process, but in a way where families are not overwhelmed, where their needs for ritual at any point during an exhumation process are paramount, where chiefs and other religious leaders are there to offer support to families as they go through this highly emotional process. But it's also to remember that bones tell truth. So if you want truth to be told, let the bones be part of that truth-telling. And I also don't see why multiple processes can't be happening in parallel. But for me, what we don't want is to allow the passing of time to silence the voices of the bones, and also not to allow inexpert exhumations to silence the voices of the bones, that we need to recognize their role as important witnesses in truth-telling.
And finally, I mean, do we have a large group of people who want exhumations, or it's just a few people?
Well, at the moment, it's a very moderate number, actually. We haven't as yet been approached by hundreds and hundreds of families wanting exhumations. But from our experience, you know, where we exhumed before, what very often happens is that it's one exhumation and reburial that leads to further requests, because someone may attend either an exhumation or a reburial, and then they say, by the way, we have a similar problem in our family and we never realized this could happen, and now that we've seen this process, now we want it for ourselves. So it has tended to be a kind of a word of mouth process. But you know, my other knowledge of Gokoro Hindi, if you like, is that from a lot of the work and history taking which we've done over many decades now, many people who were killed by Gakorohundi were actually buried in the right place at the time. They may not have been buried in the right way, okay, because sometimes 5th Brigade would just kill people, you know, kill them on the side of the road or something, and then in the dead of night, relatives could come and pick up that loved one and take them home and bury them in the family graveyard. So that's not how one wants to bury, but at least people were buried in the right place, and there's been the possibility since then for other ceremonies to take place to ensure that at some level the right way, you know, that rituals have taken place. So I don't believe that the majority of people who died in that at that time are in need of exhumation. It may come to many hundreds of individuals who want exhumation. It may even come to more numbers than that. Let's wait and see. But you know, my assumption is that many of the Gakorohundi dead do not need exhumations. I think also we need to talk, you know, briefly about things like human remains in down mine shafts, for example. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that exhuming from something like a mine shaft is technically extremely challenging and very expensive if you're going to do a proper process. You know, because mine shafts can be narrow and deep. Then at the bottom now you have human remains. Speaking to other forensic experts around the world, if you're going to do a good job, what you need to do is sink a parallel shaft to the depth of where the human remains are in this shaft, and then come across horizontally so that you're kind of widening the base of that shaft without going down on top of the human remains and damaging them. This is hugely expensive. It could cost millions of US dollars, and it means you have to engage engineering companies to come in and sink a parallel shaft. And this is now also private land, possibly. And you know, so under those circumstances only can you do what I would call a proper forensic exhumation, where you aren't going to just destroy human remains by descending on top of them and crunching them underfoot and so on. In addition to that, you're now going to have the problem that suppose you exhume 20 or 50 sets of human remains from one mine shaft. You're now not going to know who they are. So you're now going to be reburying those dead as anonymous individuals. At least they would be decently buried, you know, in coffins in perhaps a victim's acre or a Gakorohundi acre or something like that, which communities could decide. But they would remain anonymous, and it would be a massive task to put identities onto those individuals, because it would mean you would have a pool of maybe thousands of families who might lay claim to those bones. It would mean thousands of DNA tests, and perhaps even all the relatives related to a certain set of bones might be dead now or might be in the diaspora. There might be no way of attaching an identity to specific individuals. So I'm not saying it should definitely not be done, but what I'm saying is it would be an extremely complicated thing and a very expensive thing logistically to do. So it would be something that would need to be done at some very different future point in time.
But would you probably the issue of monuments, would they work better in such cases?
That would be what I would think. But again, this isn't for me to decide. I can only speak in terms of these graves of the known dead, because we've worked with families off and on for 20 years now. So I can speak, you know, with some clear position, okay, in terms of what families have told us. I do think these issues of bones and mine shafts, that's not really for me to even have an opinion on, as somebody who's not related to those dead. This is something for traditional leadership and villagers who live in the area of such mine shafts and families of the disappeared, possibly, to come forward and say, you know, what is it that they want done? Bearing in mind that retrieving human remains in those situations, if it's going to be done very professionally and without just destroying all the bones and commingling them, is going to be expensive.
Do you think there will ever be a proper process to deal with the issue of Gakorohundi in Zimbabwe?
Well, all I can say is, you know, if we're going to judge based on the words of the current leadership, and including the president of Zimbabwe, he did say, you know, just recently again in Bulawayo that he recognized the need for these issues to be dealt with, and that he was open in particular to the need for exhumations to go ahead and to happen with great sensitivity towards the needs of families, and also with great sensitivity towards the cultural needs and the community needs in relation to these dead. And so I'm hoping that this term fast-tracking refers not to now ignoring that, okay, because if we're going to be sensitive to families, sensitive to communities, sensitive to cultural needs, then that means that this process has to be done in a way where all the correct information is gathered, the exhumation is done carefully, the reburial is done by families, by traditional leadership, with the surety that the bones that they are burying are actually the bones of their particular dead. And that is not something which can be done in a hurry. It's got to be done. It can be done methodically. It can be done at a sensible pace, but it cannot be fast-tracked.
This is quite a complex issue. While we might want to hold on for a long time, we need to notice that the bones, wherever they are also breaking down because of natural causes. And with time, we might find if we take 40, 50 years, by the time we try and open these graves, there will be nothing. We're also trying to balance this with the need to do these exhumations in a proper way, where information is documented and reports are written, so that whenever there's an opportunity to take the perpetrators to the international courts, the evidence is there. Recently, the president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, said they were going to be fast-tracking the issue of exhumations, and people are asking, what is fast-tracking? What do they mean when they say they are fast-tracking? Are they going to fast-track the digging, or they're going to fast-track the process to make sure that anyone who wants to exhume their relatives, they are assisted very quick and the thing is done in a proper way? So what I'm urging the citizens of Zimbabwe, the people of Matebeleland, is that whoever wants to do an exhumation, it has to be done in a proper way, following the minimum laid down procedures on how exhumations are done, because it is important to respect the dead. They did not get a proper burial the first time they were buried, but this time around, can we afford them an opportunity to give them a decent burial so that the relatives and the family members find closure and they can continue with their lives? I hope this program was quite enlightening and educative. My name is Zenzele Ndebele. Till we meet again tomorrow, have a good day.